media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.
Well, hello there and welcome to Nowhere to Hide. I'm Brian Hyde. Today we're going to be talking about how the political class incites culture war. And one of the ways they do this is, of course, they circle ranks whenever there is anything that threatens their grasp on power. That's an interesting dynamic in the sense that basically anything that reduces the power of the state over you or me is considered extreme, extremist, a threat by those who are part of the powers that be. I'm going to give you some great examples of this. But first of all, I want to start off with where we're less than a month away from the midterm elections here in the state of Idaho, and the Attorney General's race just keeps getting more and more interesting by the day. Check out this headline. This is from, I believe this is from Idaho Press. And this is, by the way, I got to give credit to Idaho Press. This is a much more objective headline than the next one that you're going to see. Democratic nominee for Idaho Attorney General announces long list of prominent Republicans backing his campaign. That is an accurate headline, and I applaud them for not being, not being tempted to tart it up, kind of like this AP headline that was published in the Times News. Idaho Republicans supporting Democrat for Attorney General. Really? All of them? Oh no, here's the sub-headline. Dozens of past and current Idaho Republican office holders are endorsing the Democratic candidate for Attorney General in November's election. Now, I'm not going to tell you how to vote, so please don't look to me for voting advice. Well, here's who I think you should vote for. But I do want to point out that, as you're going to see in this story, it's very curious that a lot of very long-term, maybe even lifelong Republicans are suddenly breaking ranks and they're backing a Democratic candidate. Why would they do that? If you guessed, because there's a threat of extremism, give yourself $20. Better yet, take it from somebody else and then give it to yourself. I'm sure that's what they would do for you. Let's take a look at this article. This is from the Times News, and this is an AP article that they reprinted. They say nearly 50 longtime Idaho Republicans, including a former governor and dozens of other past and current office holders, on Tuesday endorsed the Democratic candidate for Attorney General in November's election. So Republicans attended a news conference at the State House with Boise attorney Tom Arkush, who said he has no political ambitions other than to run the office fairly. And you know how you can tell somebody who has no political ambitions other than to run the office fairly? They surround themselves with political cronies and lifelong politicians as political props to show just how approved they are by the political establishment. Nope, no political goal here whatsoever. Sarcasm off. So the article goes on to say, Tom Arkush is the first candidate on the Democratic ticket I've supported in my 66 years of work with the Republican Party. That's Republican Senator Patty Ann Lodge, powerful chairwoman of the State Affairs Committee, the Senate State Affairs Committee, retiring this year. Now, interestingly enough, she's going to be out of the power. She's going to be out of office, so I guess she feels safe in, throwing caution to the wind. We got to perpetuate the powers that be. 3 other current office holders endorsing Arkush also are leaving office this year, either through retirement or because the voters turned them out in the primaries. Sour grapes, anyone? But the list of Arkush supporters includes a lot of well-known Republicans. I'm not going to list all of those Republicans, but there are some very prominent names there. And Arkush said, I want to thank my Republican friends for looking at me as a candidate and not as a party politician, adding that he would like the endorsements to start a wider conversation about what voters want in the deeply conservative state that hasn't sent a Democrat to the Attorney General's office since 1991. Now listen to this line. When that conversation happens, we will move away from extremism, he said. We will become Idahoans all together again. And so what happens if he's not elected? I guess, can we assume then that the extremism is going to take hold and it's going to somehow, destroy all of our lives? Because it's some pretty binary thinking there. It's absolutist thinking. I'm sorry, I'm coming back here to Obi-Wan, that only a Sith thinks in those kinds of abs. You're either with me or you're against me. And of course, the obligatory extremism. Only if you'll elect me, someone who has shifted parties several different times in order to get my hands on power, only then will we move back to what really makes us all Idahoans, which I presume is somehow based on him being in power. Arkush and the Republicans supporting him say Labrador will turn the office into a partisan base to further his own political ambitions. Do you think he'll hold any press conferences out there on the state capitol steps surrounded by other politicians? Just wondering. Lawrence Wasden, by the way, the current and outgoing attorney general, is well known for a strategy he describes. I am assuming this is Wasden who describes it as even-handedly calling balls and strikes on legal matters, frequently irking fellow Republicans in ruby red Idaho. Now, I just want to remind you, Lawrence Wasden is the same attorney general who has kept a simple trespassing case alive against Sarah Brady for the last 2.5 years. This is the mom who took her kids to a park in Meridian and was arrested for not immediately departing when a police officer told her, you guys can't be here, because Governor Little had locked the state down, even though he insists we never locked down. But she has this criminal case of trespassing hanging over her head and is being systematically punished through lawfare. And it's because Lawrence Wasden, exercising his prerogative as attorney general, has decided to keep that case alive. You know, even-handedly calling balls and strikes on legal matters, frequently irking fellow Republicans in ruby red Idaho. In other words, he's supporting the supremacy of the state regardless of how ridiculous those charges may be. What possible connection to justice could this possibly have? I don't know. But, if as long as Wasden thinks he's being even-handed, well, I guess we'll have to take him at his word. It's kind of like a used car salesman who reminds you over and over what an honest guy he is. I'm really, really honest. The fact of the matter is, anybody who has to tell you how honest they are, that should be a red flag. Labrador, who ran for governor 4 years ago but lost to current Governor Brad Little in the Republican primary, said voters are looking for an aggressive, conservative attorney general. Now, he said he wouldn't put politics above the law and would work with lawmakers to draft bills that would survive court challenges. Now, when we talk conservative, I'm far be it for me to try to put words into Raul's Labrador's mouth here, but are we talking about things like personal liberty, limited government, freedom of conscience, private property rights, that kind of thing? Because none of those things really sound that extreme to me. That actually sounds consistent with the proper principles of government. That's the point where government actually is a good thing. And if he would be aggressively doing that, I think I would have a hard time faulting him on that. Labrador, in a statement to the Associated Press, called the Republicans endorsing Arkush backroom insiders, noting his primary win earlier this year, and he said he's been gaining supporters ever since. He had like 140-something thousand votes in that primary. So it's hardly like, well, this guy just fooled a handful of people and squeaked by with this margin. He won the primary, and who knows? This is the big question, and this is what we're going to be exploring a little bit further on in today's show is, have we reached a point where the people of Idaho are starting to wake up and recognize that the boot on the back of their necks, it doesn't matter if it's a left foot or a right foot, they don't want the boot on their necks in the first place. And that could explain a number of different changes in leadership, both in the GOP party itself or in the legislature itself, where the old time, the old guard, the good old boys and girls, if you will, were turned out in the primary. Labrador also said, I'm running to represent the people of Idaho by protecting their freedom, our state's sovereignty, and our shared Idaho values. Well, there it is. That's by far the most extreme thing I have heard anybody say in a long, long time. Again, sarcasm off. Arkush said he spent years as an independent but registered as a Republican to vote in the May primary. And he switched to the Democratic Party to run for attorney general, saying he was concerned that Labrador would run the office as a shameless political opportunist. The kind who would surround himself with political cronies and give press conferences on the state house step. That kind of political opportunist, if elected. Arkush has said he would make decisions as required by law and what is best for the state. Now, what I'm about to say is not advocating lawlessness by any stretch of the imagination, but I think we need to be very clear. The law is not the best guide of right and wrong. It's simply a matter of what is legal, what's allowed, what can you get away with, and what can't you. So if Arkush were to apply this, say, 150 some years ago, and then he would be saying that, we are to follow the law and we're duty bound by the law. Any fugitive slave that is caught having fled from his rightful master and owner must be returned to the one who owns him. And he would be obeying the law. That would be actually following the law and obeying it, to the letter. Now, is that the right thing to do? Would that be the moral thing to do? I'm just trying to illustrate the point that no, it would be what the people who were breaking that law were doing, helping these slaves escape on the Underground Railroad, either to, free states or non-slavery states, or maybe to Canada. So don't get caught up in the idea that, well, the Attorney General has to back the law and whatever the law says. What that really sounds like is whatever the federal government tells me I have to do because it's the law, and we know the federal government is supreme. I think we talked about the supremacy clause in the Constitution last time, or maybe a couple of times ago. It's only supreme in that very, very narrow area where the concerns of the states actually come together. Beyond that, the states and the people were the ones who were able to say, and were supposed to be the ones to say, what their governance would be. So what is it that makes politicians just, crave that approval over actual principle? And I suppose power is probably the most likely answer. Here's a really good example of what that looks like. Here we have Lori Likely. She's a Senate candidate in Legislative District 26 for Blaine, Lincoln, and Jerome counties. And she's celebrating in this tweet, as a representative, I championed and voted for legislation to promote early childhood literacy and education. I'm sorry, this is not a tweet. I am proud and grateful to have received the endorsement of the Idaho Education Association, a 100% rating from the Idaho Businesses for Education, and a high score from the Idaho Children Are Primary in my race to become District 26's next state senator. I will continue to work for Idaho's families and to help give our kids the tools they need to succeed in school and beyond. Kindest regards, Lori Likely. Dustin Hurst from the Idaho Freedom Foundation pointed out, or maybe it was he forwarded a tweet where someone pointed out, we have two liberals running in this race. This is not a conservative running as a conservative. This is a conservative running as a liberal and celebrating because she got the approval. She's good enough for the Liberal Teachers Union to endorse her. And I mean, on the one hand, it's like, okay, well, congratulations. That's, good for you. But for voters who are thinking about, is someone actually representing you in terms of limited government, more personal freedom, greater accountability on the part of government? Doesn't sound like that's what you're getting in this case. Okay, here's another very craven example of what pandering, for the sake of political correctness or wokeness will bring into the race. This is Miranda Marquardt for Idaho. And this is actually something she's using as a campaign talking point. And time will tell if this is something that's going to backfire on her. She says, according to her opponent, Representative Hyde, drag queens equal the biggest issue. For me, the issues are affordable housing, property tax, education, public lands, and investment in the community. But sure, go on about non-issues in an expensive culture war that does nothing for our citizens. Oh, wait, no, it gets better. This is an actual campaign piece that's put out there. Do you support drag queens in our schools? Marquardt says, damn straight drag queens in schools. I'd much rather have a qualified drag queen teaching in my schools than book burners in my legislature. But here we are. Yes, because really that's our only choices. It's either book burners or we have drag queens twerking and grinding their crotches, for the kids. Ehart, on the other hand, said, shame on those of you that would support this kind of activity with our children. I absolutely don't support it and will do everything I can to fight against exposing our children. I got to say, I'm impressed, first of all, that there are still some political candidates who actually have the guts to stand up against the woke mob, because the legacy media here is very, very clearly on the side of the woke mob. And as you're going to see, former Idaho Supreme Court Justice Jim Jones, very much out there as a woke enforcer. There's no such thing as, critical race theory. It's all this is just, to make you racists feel bad. You're just trying to avoid bad feelings. Well, I think we're going to see in this upcoming election, there may be a very real possibility that the people of Idaho have reached the point where they're putting their foot down and saying enough. So let me play something for you that I think may constitute one of the boldest political ads that I've seen. This is not an endorsement, but when's the last time you saw someone take a decisive stand like this against the woke mob?
Thing is happening across America. And it isn't isolated to California, New York, or Washington, D.C. It's in our classrooms. It's in our libraries. It's online. It's in our streets. It's in our parks. And it's happening right here in Idaho. Our children are being groomed. Idaho's governor has not only remained silent, he is actively partnering with the corporations, lobbying groups, and state agencies who have overseen this perverse assault on our children. My name is Ammon Bundy, and when you elect me governor of Idaho, I will protect our children and use all means necessary to keep them safe from this perverse, sexualized ideology. It's time Idaho puts groomers where they belong.
Holy cow. I mean, look, agree or disagree, that's what a firm stand looks like. And I got to I got to tip my hat to Ammon Bundy for being courageous enough to do it. Where you won't find very many politicians who are willing to stand up to the woke mob like that. But I think he accurately reflects the feelings of a lot of Idahoans. And this is not because they're bloodthirsty extremists and they just want to oppress these poor picked on groups. This is something Jim Jones is going to try to make the case for. Well, these are just, marginalized groups. These are people who are just deprived of any place in society. Please. We don't just have a month-long celebration in June, but we have pride festivals all through the rest of the year. And corporate America is as woke as can be. The media is as woke as can be. Entertainment is as woke as can be. Politicians are as woke as can be. That's not what happens with a marginalized segment of the society. They're the ones who are the outcasts. They're actually the ones who are like Ammon Bundy would be much more of a marginalized segment of society than anybody who's part of the, either the pronoun gang or, the LGBTQ plus community. The question here is, though, is there a culture war going on? I believe that there really is. And I also believe that we are going to be seeing people voting based upon that choice. Not because they're out there looking for an excuse, I want to be against this and I want to be against that, but because it's being forced on us in so many different areas. I'll give you some good examples here, but this is an op-ed from Jim Jones. This was published in the Idaho Capital Sun. Zombie laws designed to intimidate clutter Idaho's statute books. Now, he describes these as some laws covering topics like abortion and critical race theory are designed to intimidate disfavored groups, from engaging in lawful activities. In other words, what's permitted by law, not necessarily what's moral or good, writes guest columnist Jim Jones. So here are a couple of examples of what that looks like. Jones says an example of a zombie law is the No Public Funds for Abortion Act, which was attacked by the White House on September 27th as extreme and backwards. Well, you better get used to hearing that word extreme a lot. And by the way, the White House, would that be Joe Biden or would that be his handlers who are constantly walking back the many things he's saying? Putin cannot remain in power. Well, he didn't really mean to say that. The pandemic is over. He really didn't mean to say that. Which White House are we talking about? The puppet or the puppet's handlers? Just wondering. Anyway, we're supposed to feel bad because taxpayers not wanting to use their money or have their money taken from them and then used to fund abortions, that is extreme and backwards. Now, the law prohibits state colleges and public schools from promoting abortions. Is that why people go to school? To hear, how abortion is so great, the highest celebration of life? Hardly. There was absolutely no evidence that such activity was going on in the state. This is a common refrain for Jim Jones, but the fact was of little concern to the culture war extremists in our legislature. Okay, here's another example. Our extremist legislators, did he mention they're extremist? Okay, have made it a practice to weaponize culture war issues to intimidate target groups that are doing things that, again, are constitutionally permissible. Morally reprehensible sometimes, but hey, constitutionally permissible, so let's all get behind it. Critical race theory, he says, is another such issue. Now, Jim claims that there has been a frantic search for critical race theory by extremists during the last couple of years, but nobody has found what he calls any credible evidence that it exists in the gem state. That's another way of him saying, I've not seen anything that I couldn't absolutely pretend not to see. So, the sun is not shining. I don't see anything. La, 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 covering his ears, chanting out loud. He says the law is constitutionally unenforceable on First Amendment and vagueness grounds, but that is of no import to the drafters. Challenging such laws in court is costly and time-consuming. So he says most schools simply give in to the intimidation and limit their teaching of historical facts. And by that, he means they limit their teaching of sanitized facts that only teach a leftist oppressor versus the oppressed point of view that requires not only the acknowledgement of every sin committed by those who came before us, but requires us to reject whatever good they did as well. This is classic leftist methodology, and Jim is one of its staunchest defenders. He says Idaho has another law that criminalizes disseminating material harmful to minors. Now, the law is subject to constitutional challenge. He says extremist legislators, did he mention they were extremist? I didn't know if you caught that. Called attention to the law earlier this year when they tried to criminalize librarians under its provisions. What they actually tried to criminalize was giving very explicit, inappropriate material to young children. Okay, this is not about we're out to get the librarians. It's about this stuff should not be made available to young children. They narrowly failed this year, he says, but have made it known they will try again next year. Should they be successful, there will be just one more zombie law on the books serving no valid purpose, because really kids seeing, cartoons and depictions of kids performing oral sex on each other or on adults, that's a perfectly good thing, and that would be intimidating librarians from properly doing their work. I guess if properly doing their work involves perverting young minds, well, he might have a point. Then again, perhaps he's exaggerating a bit here. He also says the legislature passed a law this year giving an abortion patient and her family members the right to collect a minimum of $20,000 each from an abortion provider. Idaho law, because of the overturning of Roe v. Wade, Idaho law reflects that abortion is not going to be just a simple on-demand thing. It's not going to be a matter of convenience. Whoops, I got pregnant. It's time to take care of the mistake, and avoid the consequences. This is protecting the sanctity of life. This is preventing the unnecessary taking of an innocent life. He says the law has a number of legal infirmities, which he doesn't really describe here, but will likely remain on the books to continue intimidating doctors from even thinking about providing a medically necessary abortion. Most abortions are elective. They are for convenience. They are not medically necessary. And this law in Idaho does provide for if there is like a legitimate case of the mother dying, it would be permitted. That doesn't mean she has to do it, but that isn't always an option. In the meantime, this is reflective of the values of the people of the state of Idaho, or at least a majority of them. And look, we have to make compromises on some things. The one-size-fits-all federal approach really wasn't working all that great, despite all the angst and pearl clutching that came when Roe v. Wade was overturned. But just like you won't find legalized gambling outside of the state lottery, just like you won't find legal weed in Idaho, that too is a decision of the people who elect lawmakers to make laws that reflect their values. Now, will you find them in other states? Absolutely. Is abortion totally legal on demand in other states? Yes, it is in some states. But the whole idea of federalism was that each of the states retains that degree of its own identity. Sovereignty is actually the word we're looking for here, by which they can set the tone of what their culture, what their society is all about. And that's really what this comes down to. This is part and parcel of a culture war. Now, Jim Jones wants to pretend like there's no such thing as a culture war. If there is, it's only because you people, meaning you extremists, did I mention he sees that as extreme, are somehow pushing back against those who would otherwise take us in a direction that a majority of people have not been willing to go for many, many generations. And maybe we should wonder, before we tear that fence down, do you think we ought to ask a few questions about why was that fence put up in the first place? So I want to share a couple of thoughts with you. First of all, on what culture is, and then a couple of thoughts on why this culture war matters more than we might think. I'm going to start with a quote from Doug Casey, who says, culture is composed of the customs, traditions, and beliefs of a group of people. It's a way of seeing the world and interpreting reality. It determines what is right and wrong and good and evil. Culture is what ties people together or divides them. It's a composite of religion, politics, economics, philosophy, and language. But the composite is more important than any one component. Culture is what ties groups and countries together. So let me explain a little bit about what that looks like. So growing up in Twin Falls, as I was going to high school, it was an absolutely common sight. If you were to look at the pickup trucks that were parked in the back parking lot by the shop building, the cowboys and others who parked their trucks back there, more often than not, you would find that many of them had a rifle rack in the back window of their truck. And more often than not, they had a shotgun or a .22 or maybe a hunting rifle sitting there while they were at school. I know today people are like, oh, where are the smelling salts? Again, how could that be? How is it that they weren't just killing each other? It's because the thought never occurred to us. that somebody should pick up a gun and go around and start shooting people. It was not part of our culture. In fact, the only during my time in high school, there were fist fights and things like that. There was one time that a young man pulled out a pocket knife and stabbed another student in the side, and it was unheard of. The shockwave that it sent through the entire community was just like, you don't do stuff like that. Why? Because our culture was not one of, well, we pull out a weapon when we settle our disputes, and you draw blood or you fight to the bloody finish. That's the power of culture. It doesn't have to be imposed. You just don't want to end up on the wrong side of morality. And in this case, the full weight of the community's morality was absolutely like, you don't do that. That is just flat wrong. It didn't require a law. It didn't require some official policy. It was just accepted. Just like once upon a time, it was accepted that, getting pregnant out of wedlock, that's kind of a low-class thing to do. Don't do it. So let's take a look at another quote here. And this is from Fred Reed, who says, the virtue of a dominant culture is that it doesn't need to be imposed. There were things you just didn't do because you understood that doing so would place you on the wrong side of morality. Now, he makes another observation here, and this is the one that's really what brings home why the culture war matters. He says, suppose that one culture has a strong work ethic, fairly strict sexual morality, low illegitimacy, low crime, respect for study, and proper use of the national language. Now suppose that another culture has precisely opposite values. What happens when you bring the two of those cultures together? The effect will always be to lower the civilized group to the uncivilized. Now, I realize that's a very politically incorrect thing to even suggest, but that's exactly what we see happening. And all the drag queen story hours and all the pride festivals and stuff, celebrating sexual things here and there. Now we got to bring kids into this situation. That's lowering the civilized part of our society down to a less civilized, more primitive part of our society. And that stuff doesn't come without consequences, whether it's the bending of young minds or trying to twist them into self-hatred and, well, I guess I better transition. My parents asked me my favorite color, says a little girl, and I said blue, and they said, do you like sports? And I said, yeah, well, let's get your surgery scheduled. Most of the culture war can be fought outside of the political arena. And the reason it can be fought there is because there are other institutions in society that have great influence. Church, family, community, business, academia. Well, used to be academia could, now it's pretty much taken over. Media, same thing, These are all institutions that play a complementary role to government. And yet when government gets involved, when it gets politicized, somehow it turns into this struggle for power. That's exactly what we're seeing today. I'm going to be very curious to see what the landscape looks like a month from now, once the midterm elections have come and gone. Because I have a hunch, and I hope it's right. Maybe I'm going to be dead wrong. Maybe I'm going to be the one sitting here going, well, I guess I'll be eating my words with both hands. But I think that enough people have seen where this cultural shift is taking us and said, that's not right. That's not right for me. It's not right for my kids. And I hope that they will exercise what influence they have within that political realm, effectively. Now, if that sounds like I'm telling you how to vote, I don't know how to make it more, nondescript. I'm not telling you who to vote for, but I'm telling you, we actually have some choices this time around. Maybe it would be in our interest to really think about who and what we are voting for, what we stand for when we enter that voting booth. If we can go in there as informed citizens, knowing more about the candidates, knowing more about the issues, but also understanding the underlying cultural undercurrent that is flowing through all of this and beneath all of this, I hope to see a continuing shift like we have seen throughout the better part of this year. Yeah, it's not an easy thing, and it's going to send some people into a full freak out mode. But how valuable are the things that we really, want to hang on to, like personal freedom, like freedom of conscience, like limited government, like property rights. I'm Brian Hyde, and this is Nowhere to Hide.
Are biased, the Idaho Press Club are biased, all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm crying.
Nobody wants to see
Dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.